Human life is always centered around relationships. We are born into connection, grow up with emotional bonds, and throughout our lives, whether we realize it or not, we are constantly influenced by those around us. But here's the intriguing part. The longer a man lives without a meaningful romantic relationship, the more he changes in ways he may not even recognize. This is not merely about loneliness, it is a profound transformation of psychology, thinking patterns, and behavioral nature. There is a little-known truth. The human mind does not remain in a state of passive waiting but constantly adapts to its surroundings. A man who has been without a relationship for a long time is not necessarily single because he hasn't found the right person, but because his psyche has undergone an unconscious restructuring. Without deep emotional connection, the brain automatically adjusts to isolation, leading to long-term consequences that he may not even be aware of. From altered perceptions of love to changes in how he responds to social stimuli, everything is shaped by the prolonged absence of a meaningful relationship. This article will delve deep into the psychology behind this phenomenon, not just to explain it but to raise important questions. Is isolation truly a choice? Or is it a sophisticated defense mechanism of the mind, trapping the individual without him even realizing it? And more importantly, can this psychological loop be broken? These are the very topics that the Practical Philosophy channel explores, helping people gain deeper insights into themselves, society, and the intricate psychological mechanisms shaping our lives. Many people mistakenly assume that a man who has been single for a long time simply hasn't met the right person. However, the reality is far more complex. The human mind is not a machine that remains idle, waiting for love to arrive and restart from where it left off. Instead, it constantly adapts, recalibrating itself to fit the reality it faces. Without deep emotional connection, a man's mind continuously restructures itself, gradually perceiving isolation as a natural state. This leads to a series of consequences that he may not even notice. Subtle shifts in how he views relationships, significant changes in emotional perception, empathy, and social interactions. From a philosophical perspective, this reflects the principle of impermanence in life. No state is ever permanent. A mind that has been isolated for too long loses its original sensitivity to love and connection. When consciousness adapts to solitude, it not only loses the ability to be vulnerable, the core element of love, but also starts perceiving change as a threat. From a spiritual standpoint, this is a manifestation of mental contraction, where a person increasingly falls into self-centeredness, clouded by a sense of self-sufficiency or skepticism about the value of connection. So, is this isolation truly a choice? Or is it merely a subconscious self-protection mechanism designed to avoid past wounds? This question is not just psychological but deeply philosophical. If a man spends too long in isolation, will he still be open enough to embrace a new relationship? Or has isolation become ingrained in his identity, a cycle he does not even realize he is trapped in? These are the very issues that the Practical Philosophy channel continuously explores, helping people break free from the limits of perception and gain a deeper understanding of how the human mind operates. This article does not merely analyze this phenomenon, it unravels the deeper layers of psychology, decoding the invisible mechanisms that have turned isolation into a fixed state of being. Loneliness is not just the absence of a relationship, it gradually becomes a way of life. A deeply ingrained mindset that reshapes how a man perceives himself and the world around him. Is isolation truly a conscious choice? Or is it merely the result of a chain of psychological defense responses? Have the years spent without intimate connection silently built an invisible wall, one that even the person within it fails to recognize? And more importantly, if such a wall does exist, How can it be broken? These questions are not only significant from a psychological perspective but also hold profound philosophical and spiritual implications, because we are not merely discussing love, but the very essence of human connection and existence itself. The story of a man living in solitude is not just an individual experience. It is a mirror reflecting a fundamental aspect of modern society, where people are increasingly disconnected, not only from relationships but also from their own inner selves. So let us dive deeper, peel back the layers of this issue, and explore truths that perhaps you have never considered before. Part 1. How the mind adapts to isolation. At first, when a man enters a period of living alone without a romantic relationship, he often feels a sense of liberation, no longer burdened by obligations or the expectations of others. He can fully focus on himself, pursue his passions, and enjoy absolute independence. For those who have experienced exhausting or painful relationships, this phase may feel like a necessary pause to regain balance. However, from a psychological perspective, this freedom does not always bring true peace. When a man lives alone for an extended period, his mind does not simply enjoy independence, it gradually adjusts to this state. If, in the beginning, solitude feels empowering, over time, it can transform into a form of avoidance from connection. Humans do not just passively react to their environment. They are shaped by unconscious defense mechanisms that gradually close them off, often without realization. From a philosophical standpoint, this can be seen as an existential paradox. The more one seeks personal freedom, the more one risks falling into a cycle of isolation. Here, we can connect this to Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming, the idea that true growth requires challenges and external reflections. If a man solely focuses on himself without interaction with others, is he truly evolving, or is he merely reinforcing a static image of himself? In reality, social connections do more than provide companionship, they act as mirrors, revealing hidden aspects of our inner selves. From a spiritual perspective, prolonged isolation can gradually make a person's soul rigid, causing them to lose their innate capacity for empathy and connection. Humans are fundamentally relational beings, and when one denies or forgets this, their consciousness begins to contract, becoming resistant to change. This is why many men who have lived alone for too long struggle to open up again, because their minds have been rewired to perceive isolation as their natural state. On a broader level, independence is not always a conscious choice. Sometimes, it is the result of a psychological adaptation, where people gradually become accustomed to solitude without realizing that they are losing their ability to engage naturally with others. This adaptation does not happen instantly but rather unfolds subtly, shaping how a man perceives himself, relationships, and the very nature of love. But humans are not static beings. We do not simply react to circumstances, we constantly adjust to them. And the mind is no exception. When a man spends too long without emotional bonding, his brain does not remain in a state of waiting. Instead, it restructures itself to function within a reality of isolation. Psychological mechanisms related to empathy, connection, and vulnerability slowly begin to fade. Like an unused muscle, these abilities atrophy, and eventually, he starts to see relationships as foreign, perhaps even unnecessary. In the early stages, independence brings a sense of control, a valued freedom that he enjoys. But over time, it ceases to be a conscious state and instead becomes an unconscious defense mechanism. When no longer required to navigate the complexities of a relationship, such as differences in thought, the necessity of compromise, or the vulnerability of love, he gradually loses the ability to process these experiences. What once felt like liberation eventually becomes a self-constructed prison of habitual isolation. From a spiritual perspective, This transformation is not merely a psychological shift but also an alteration in one's energetic field. As a person drifts away from relationships, their vibrational frequency diminishes, making them less receptive to emotional energy from others. This is not just disconnection from people, it is a detachment from one's own sacred essence. Where love and connection are fundamental aspects of existence, those who are truly on a spiritual path understand that independence does not mean isolation. And freedom is not synonymous with rejecting connection. A truly evolved soul is not one that is closed off but one that remains open to the flow of life, embracing deep relationships that foster growth and expansion. Thus, when a man unconsciously traps himself in the cycle of isolation, it is not a sign of enlightenment but rather an indication of a contracted consciousness, a state in which he may believe he has mastered his life. Yet in reality, he is losing himself in the dryness of emotional detachment. Part 2. Unconscious psychological transformations. What happens when a man lives without a relationship for an extended period? It is a gradual yet powerful transformation, not just in how he perceives the world, but also in how he experiences himself. 1. The loss of emotional vulnerability. Vulnerability is the foundation of all deep relationships, as it allows people to form authentic and meaningful connections. To love, one must not only open up but also accept the possibility of getting hurt, because true intimacy is built within this fragility. However, if this practice is neglected for too long, the brain starts to adapt, shielding itself from the risks of emotional pain. This process, known as defensive adaptation in psychology, gradually builds an emotional shell, making individuals less sensitive to external emotional cues. A man who has been alone for too long gradually loses his sensitivity to understanding and responding to others' emotions. Neural mechanisms related to empathy, particularly the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, can become less active when not regularly engaged. This diminishes his ability to recognize subtle emotional signals from others, weakening both his natural empathy and responsiveness. From a philosophical perspective, the loss of vulnerability affects not only love but also inner growth. Philosopher Martin Buber, in his theory of I-thou relationships, emphasized that true connections cannot exist unless one is willing to enter shared emotional space without barriers. A man who has lived in isolation for too long loses the habit of accepting imperfections in others, leading to a tendency to idealize relationships or reject them altogether, trapping him in a psychological loop of isolation. On a spiritual level, emotional openness is not just about connecting with others but also about connecting with one's deepest self. A closed mind limits not only relational growth but also self-awareness and spiritual expansion. By rejecting vulnerability, a man unconsciously rejects the very process of soul development. 2. Rigidity in habits and thinking. When no one enters a man's life to challenge his thoughts, he begins to develop fixed mental patterns, not only in his beliefs but also in how he perceives himself and the world. His personal habits become deeply ingrained, from eating and daily routines to how he approaches work and problem solving. This creates a psychological safe zone, where everything happens on his terms, uninterrupted by external differences. However, this safe zone is not a fortress of strength. It is an invisible cage that traps his emotional and intellectual flexibility. A man who has lived alone for a long time becomes too accustomed to his own way of functioning, making it increasingly difficult to accept change from external sources. When meeting new people, their presence is not merely a new element but can be perceived as an intrusion into a long-established world. Differences in thoughts, habits, or ways of expressing emotions may feel like a threat rather than an opportunity for growth. Over time, he may lose adaptability, becoming increasingly impatient with relational compromises, leading to deepening self-isolation. From a psychological standpoint, this phenomenon can be explained by confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and reinforce experiences that validate existing beliefs while filtering out or dismissing information that challenges them. This reduces his ability to embrace new perspectives, reinforcing a rigid and self-confirming thought system. Philosophically, this represents a paradox of freedom. A man who believes he is in complete control of his life is, in reality, constrained by the limitations he has unknowingly imposed upon himself. Taoism teaches that flexibility is the essence of wisdom. Only that which remains adaptable can thrive in the ever-changing flow of the universe. A mind rigidly attached to its own structures is not truly free but is instead confined in its own repetitive cycle, resisting expansion and true self-discovery. Eastern philosophy, particularly Taoism, emphasizes that flexibility is not just the key to survival but also the core of enlightenment and inner freedom. A river cannot flow if it is blocked, just as a mind cannot expand if it clings to old frameworks. Change is not something to fear, it is the very nature of life. Just like water that adapts to any form while retaining its essence, a fluid mind remains open to new experiences without being trapped by fear or resistance. This is not just a philosophical principle but a profound spiritual truth. Only by letting go of rigidity can one truly attain freedom and wisdom. 3. Unrealistic expectations of relationships. Without real-world experience to adjust their expectations, some men develop idealized or pessimistic views of love. Some begin to believe that they must find the perfect partner, someone who aligns with them in every way, without any differences in thoughts, emotions, or lifestyle. This creates an unrealistic model, making it easy to be disappointed when faced with the natural differences that exist in real relationships. Evolutionary psychology explains that humans tend to romanticize potential partners when they lack real relationship experience. The brain constructs an ideal image based on imagination rather than reality. Without the challenges of an actual relationship, they fail to develop skills in conflict resolution, emotional adjustment, and deep empathy. This traps them in a loop of high expectations without the readiness to face the realities of a true relationship. Others, however, may develop a pessimistic view of love, believing that all relationships are full of pain, conflict, and disappointment. This perspective may stem from past negative experiences or exposure to social narratives and media portrayals of dysfunctional relationships. As a result, they withdraw, avoiding relationships altogether to shield themselves from potential hurt, without realizing that their isolation is equally damaging to their well-being and personal growth. From a philosophical perspective, this reflects human resistance to reality. As Alain de Botton once said, "Love is not about finding a perfect person, but about learning to love an imperfect person perfectly." A real relationship is not about two flawless individuals coming together but about a continuous process of understanding, adaptation, and acceptance. Only when a person learns to adjust their expectations to reality can they enter a relationship with a mature and healthy mindset. Conclusion of Part 2. These unconscious psychological transformations occur subtly but profoundly. The loss of vulnerability, increased rigidity, and distorted expectations create a self-reinforcing cycle of isolation. At first, solitude may feel like a conscious choice, but over time, it becomes an automatic psychological adaptation, shaping how a man sees relationships, himself, and love itself. But does this adaptation truly serve him, or does it limit his ability to experience the depth of human connection? More importantly, can it be reversed? Understanding these mental shifts is the first step toward breaking free from the loop, reconnecting with oneself, and rediscovering the value of deep relationships. The question remains, is long-term solitude truly a path to independence? Or is it a silent retreat from the very essence of human existence? This is exactly what practical philosophy seeks to explore, helping individuals challenge their perceptions, break unconscious limitations, and step into a more awakened understanding of human psychology and relationships. Conclusion: isolation, whether it is a conscious choice or an unconscious adaptation, leaves a profound imprint on the human psyche. A man who has spent too long in solitude does not merely change the way he perceives love. His very mental structure transforms, from how he experiences emotions, to his capacity for empathy, to the way he interacts with the world around him. However, this transformation is not irreversible. Just as the mind can adapt to isolation, it can also relearn how to connect. The most crucial step is recognizing this cycle, understanding that loneliness does not have to be a permanent state, and that humans are not meant to live purely in independence but to connect, to love, and to be loved. If you find yourself caught in this loop, remember, change does not always require a drastic breakthrough. Sometimes, it begins with a small decision, opening up to others, embracing a new connection, or simply acknowledging that despite being accustomed to solitude, the longing for companionship still exists within you. At Practical Philosophy, we aim to provide deep insights into psychology, philosophy, and human existence, helping you understand yourself and break free from unconscious limitations. If this article has given you something to reflect on, consider sharing it with others who might need this message. Let's create a space for understanding, love, and personal growth, because each of us deserves genuine and meaningful connections in this lifetime.